Redditor 1. I've been trying to write this down for months now. My hands still shake when I think about that night in Amsterdam, but I need to get it out. Maybe then the nightmares will stop. Maybe then I'll be able to look at the sky again without feeling that bone-deep dread that's become my constant companion. It started innocently enough. Josh and I had spent the afternoon at one of Amsterdam's famous smart shops, where we'd purchased some psilocybin truffles. We weren't looking for anything too intense, just a gentle exploration of consciousness in a city known for its open-minded approach to such experiences. The sunset had been particularly beautiful that day, painting the canals in shades of amber and rose. As our trip began winding down around 11 p.m., we found ourselves in Vondelpark. The late-hour emptiness of the normally bustling park felt perfect for our mellowed-out state of mind. We settled onto a bench, and Josh pulled out a joint he'd rolled earlier. For the road?" he asked, already knowing my answer. The ember glowed orange in the darkness as we passed it back and forth, letting the last waves of the mushrooms wash over us. The spring air carried that particular Amsterdam dampness. Not quite rain, but a perpetual moisture that made everything feel alive and breathing. "Look at those stars," Josh said, exhaling a cloud of sweet smoke. "You can actually see them tonight." He was right. Amsterdam's usually cloudy skies had cleared, revealing a tapestry of stars that seemed to pulse gently in rhythm with my still, slightly altered perception. I leaned back, feeling the wooden slats of the bench press against my spine, and tried to identify constellations through the tree branches overhead. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a satellite, one of those bright points that moves steadily across the night sky. But this was different. Its movement was wrong. Instead of the straight, predictable path of a satellite or aircraft, this object drifted like a leaf caught in an invisible current. It would pause, then surge forward, then drift sideways in a way that defied every law of aerodynamics I knew. "Josh," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the object. "Josh, do you see that?" There was a long pause before he answered, and when he did, his voice was tight with tension. Yeah, I see it." We watched in silence as the object, no bigger than a pinprick of light from our perspective, performed its impossible dance among the stars. For 45 seconds, I know because I counted, trying to convince myself this was just some lingering effect of the mushrooms, we tracked its movement across the sky. Then it stopped. Just stopped. Dead still in the middle of the sky. "That's not possible," Josh muttered. "That's not..." The object dropped. Not fell, dropped. Like someone had grabbed it and yanked it, straight down toward Earth. My heart lurched into my throat as I watched it plummet, expecting some kind of impact, an explosion, anything. But it stopped again, now much closer, hovering maybe 1,000 feet above the park. That's when the humming started. It was so low at first that I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly at the edges. Josh grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises I'd find the next day. "We should go," he said, but neither of us moved. We couldn't. The humming had become a physical force, pinning us to the bench like insects in a display case. The object, craft, whatever it was, had grown from a point of light to a dark shape against the stars. It was roughly triangular, but its edges seemed to shift and flow like mercury. As I stared, trying to force my eyes to make sense of what they were seeing, a beam of light shot down from its center, hitting the ground about 50 meters from where we sat. The beam wasn't bright exactly. It was more like a cylinder of darkness that somehow glowed, an impossibility that made my already mushroom-addled brain feel like it was folding in on itself. Where it touched the ground, the grass turned white, with frost. That's when we saw the figures. They emerged from the shadows at the edge of the beam, 3 of them, moving with a fluid grace that reminded me of octopi I'd seen at the aquarium. They were tall, impossibly tall, their limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. Their skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating voids in the shape of bodies. One of them turned toward us. I wish I could say I saw red eyes or gray skin or any of the things you read about in UFO encounters. But what I saw was much worse. Nothing. Where a face should have been, there was just absence. A hole in reality shaped like a head. Josh made a sound then, not quite a scream, more like the whimper a dying animal might make. The figure's head tilted at an angle that should have snapped any earthly spine, and I felt something brush against my consciousness, a presence that felt ancient and cold and utterly, utterly alien. "We see you." The words weren't spoken. They appeared in my mind like frost forming on a window, bringing with them images that my brain struggles even now to process. Vast cities underground, oceans of liquid metal, skies filled with colors that have no names in any human language. "We have always seen you." The presence in my mind deepened, and with it came understanding that turned my blood to ice. They hadn't just noticed us by chance. They had been watching for years. Every moment I thought I was alone, every private thought I'd ever had, they had been there, observing, analyzing, cataloging. The mushrooms we'd taken earlier hadn't revealed them to us. They had chosen that moment to reveal themselves to us. "You are ready now." Ready for what? I wanted to ask, but my mouth wouldn't work. My body wasn't mine anymore. I felt myself standing, watched helplessly as Josh did the same. The figures beckoned with limbs that seemed to bend through dimensions I couldn't perceive, and we began walking toward them. That's when the church bells started. The Westerkerk, Amsterdam's highest church tower, began tolling midnight. The sound sliced through whatever hold the creatures had on us, and suddenly I could move again. Josh and I looked at each other for a split second, then ran. We ran like we'd never run before, out of the park and through the streets of Amsterdam, past confused tourists and concerned locals. We didn't stop until we reached our hostel, where we locked ourselves in our room and sat in silence until dawn, jumping at every sound. The next morning, we found perfect circles of dead grass in Vondelpark, frostweight despite the spring warmth. When we touched them, our fingers came away stained with a silvery substance that disappeared when we tried to show it to others. Josh flew home that day. I haven't heard from him since, though I've tried to reach out. His social media accounts are gone, his phone disconnected. Sometimes I wonder if he was ever real or if he was just part of their plan, a witness they provided to make the experience feel more credible. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know they're still watching. Every night now, I hear that humming, just at the edge of perception. Sometimes I wake to find frost on my windows, even in summer. And when I look at the stars, which I try never to do, I see movements that shouldn't be possible, shapes that shouldn't exist. They said I was ready. Ready for what? I don't know. But I have a feeling I'm going to find out, whether I want to or not. I'm writing this down, not because I expect anyone to believe me, but because I need there to be a record. If something happens to me, if I disappear like Josh, at least someone will know why. If you're reading this and you've seen them too, you're not crazy. They're real. They're watching. And sooner or later, they'll let you know that they see you too. Just, whatever you do, don't look up at the stars. Don't give them a reason to think you're ready. Because I'm starting to understand that sometimes ignorance really is bliss. And knowledge can be a curse. Redditor 2. I've never told anyone this story before, except Jake. And after what happened to him last month, I guess I'm the only one left who knows the truth. I've been sitting on it for over a year now, letting it eat away at me like acid through metal. Maybe writing it down will help. Maybe someone out there has seen what we saw that night. Maybe they can tell me I'm not crazy. It was just another Thursday evening last October, the kind where the air starts getting that autumn bite, and the darkness creeps in earlier and earlier each day. Jake and I were standing outside his house on Maple Street, killing time like we always did. We both worked from home back then, and these evening hangouts were our way of maintaining sanity, just two friends, shooting the breeze, watching the neighborhood settle into its nighttime routine. The streetlights had just flickered on, casting those familiar orange pools onto the wet pavement. It had rained earlier, and the air still carried that peculiar metallic scent that comes after a storm. Jake was in the middle of telling me about his latest dating app disaster, something about a woman who collected taxidermied squirrels, when we both fell silent at exactly the same moment. I remember checking my phone right before it happened, 8:32 p.m. That detail is burned into my memory, along with everything else that followed. It started as a slight shimmer above Jake's roof, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. You know that feeling when you've been staring at your computer screen too long and the world gets a bit fuzzy around the edges? But then Jake stopped mid-sentence, his head tilting upward, and I knew he was seeing it. The shimmer began to take shape, a perfect semicircle of lights, maybe 12 or 15 of them, arranged in an arc that stretched across the sky. They weren't bright like stars or harsh like airplane lights. Instead, they seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, fading in and out like heartbeats. The closest I can come to describing it is like watching jellyfish in dark water. But even that doesn't quite capture the otherworldly nature of what we saw. "Are you seeing this?" Jake whispered, his breath visible in the cool night air. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The formation was moving now, climbing higher into the sky with a grace that defied physics. No helicopter or drone could move like that, fluid and precise, like ink spreading through water. The lights continued their hypnotic dance, brightening and dimming in perfect synchronization. That's when we noticed the silence. Living in the suburbs, you get used to a certain level of background noise, distant traffic, dogs barking, the hum of air conditioners. But at that moment, it was like someone had pressed the mute button on the world. Even the crickets had stopped chirping. Jake fumbled for his phone, presumably to record what we were seeing, but his screen was black. So was mine when I checked it. Both phones were fully charged just minutes before. But now, they were completely dead. The lights continued their ascent, and as they rose higher, I felt a pressure building in my ears, like being underwater. Jake must have felt it too because he winced and shook his head. The air around us felt charged, like the moments before a lightning strike. And then things got worse. The semicircle of lights began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster. As it spun, the lights seemed to stretch, leaving trails in the sky like a cosmic spirograph. But what really got to me was the color, or rather, the way my brain couldn't quite process what color they were. Sometimes they looked blue, sometimes purple, and sometimes they seemed to be a color I'd never seen before, and haven't seen since. That's when the humming started. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, exactly. It was more like a vibration you felt in your teeth and bones, like standing too close to a massive speaker, playing a note too low to hear. My nose started bleeding, and when I looked over at Jake, thin trails of crimson were running from his ears. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run inside, to call someone, to do something, but I couldn't move. Neither could Jake. We stood there, rooted to the spot, as the lights continued their impossible dance above us. And then they noticed us. I don't know how I knew they were aware of us. There was no dramatic moment of recognition, no beam of light shooting down from above. It was more like the sudden, gut-wrenching certainty you get when you realize you're being watched in what you thought was an empty room. The rotation slowed and the semicircle oriented itself directly above us. The humming intensified, and I felt my knees buckle. Jake grabbed my arm to steady me, or maybe to steady himself, I'm not sure which. That's when we heard it. Not with our ears, but somehow directly in our minds. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like concepts, ideas, emotions, all compressed into a single moment of understanding. And what we understood was simple. We had seen something we weren't supposed to see. The lights began to fade then. Not all at once, but one by one, like stars being erased from the sky. The pressure in my ears subsided, and the humming faded away. Within minutes, the night was normal again, crickets chirping, distant traffic, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Our phones came back to life simultaneously, screens lighting up with missed calls and messages. The time displayed was 9:47 p.m. Somehow, over an hour had passed. Jake and I didn't talk about what we'd seen, not right away. We just stood there for a while longer, staring at the now empty sky. Finally, he turned to me and said, "We should probably keep this to ourselves." I agreed. What else could we do? Who would believe us? But that wasn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. Over the next few months, things started happening. Small things at first. Streetlights going dark when we walked under them, electronics malfunctioning in our presence, strange patterns showing up in our photos. Then the dreams started. Always the same. that semicircle of lights, that impossible color, that bone-deep humming. Some mornings we'd wake up with nosebleeds or find ourselves in different rooms than where we'd fallen asleep. Jake started seeing them everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the corners of his eyes. He became convinced they were watching us, studying us. I tried to tell myself he was just paranoid, that the stress was getting to him. But then I started seeing them too. Last month, Jake disappeared. The police found his car parked at the overlook outside town, engine still running, driver's door open. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints, nothing. Just his phone on the seat, open to his camera app, showing a single photo. A semicircle of lights in the night sky. I know they took him, just like I know they're watching me now as I write this. The lights in my room have been flickering for the past hour, and there's that familiar pressure building in my ears. My nose is starting to bleed again. But I had to get this story out. Someone needs to know what happened. Someone needs to believe us. If you're reading this and you've seen them too, those lights in the shape of a semicircle, those colors that shouldn't exist, don't stop to watch them. Don't try to understand them. Just run. And whatever you do, don't let them know you've seen them. Because they're always watching, always listening, always waiting, and they're getting closer. Redditor 3. I've never told anyone this before, but what happened that winter evening in 1990 has haunted me for over 30 years. The memory surfaces sometimes, usually on those bitter cold nights when the stars seem too bright and too close. My sister Sarah doesn't talk about it anymore. She says she doesn't remember, but the slight tremor in her voice tells me otherwise. I was 10 years old and Sarah was 12. We lived in a small town in Minnesota, the kind where everyone knew everyone else's business, but nobody talked about the strange things that sometimes happened in the backfields. Our house sat at the edge of town, backing up against acres of empty farmland that transformed into a crystalline wonderland every winter. That afternoon, Mom had shooed us outside, claiming we were driving her crazy with our cabin fever antics. "Go build a snowman or something," she'd said, barely looking up from her romance novel. "Just be back before dark." The sun was already low in the sky, painting everything in that peculiar winter twilight that makes familiar things look strange and strange things look ordinary. Sarah and I had been working on a snow fort, our breaths creating ghostly clouds in the frigid air. My fingers were starting to ache inside my mittens, but I didn't want to go in yet. There was something magical about being out there, just the two of us, surrounded by the profound silence that only comes with fresh snow. "Hey, Squirt," Sarah called out. "Race you to the old maple tree." Before I could respond, she was already running, her purple winter jacket a blur against the white landscape. I took off after her, my boots crunching through the crusty top layer of snow. That's when I saw it. I stopped so suddenly I nearly fell forward. "Sarah!" I yelled, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the winter air. She must have heard something in my tone because she stopped immediately and turned around. "What's wrong?" she asked, jogging back to me. I pointed upward, my arm shaking. There, suspended in the darkening sky, were 3 fireballs arranged in a perfect triangle. Each one blazed with an intensity that hurt my eyes, trailing what looked like smoky tails that reminded me of the sparklers we played with on the 4th of July. But these weren't moving like normal meteors or shooting stars. They just hung there, maybe 100 kilometers away, defying everything I knew about how things were supposed to work. "Do you see that?" I whispered, suddenly afraid that speaking too loudly might draw their attention. Sarah nodded slowly, her face pale beneath her wool hat. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching these impossible lights in the sky. They didn't move, didn't fade, didn't do anything except exist in a way that made my stomach feel like it was full of ice water. Finally, Sarah grabbed my hand. "Come on," she said, trying to sound casual but failing. "Let's finish the fort." That's what I remember most clearly about that moment, how desperately we both pretended everything was normal, how we forced ourselves to turn our backs on those lights and continue playing in the snow. But we didn't really play, we just went through the motions, both of us stealing glances over our shoulders every few seconds. The lights were still there when Mom called us in for dinner. We never mentioned them to our parents. Somehow, we both knew they wouldn't believe us, or worse, they would believe us and be as scared as we were. That night, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom window faced the backfield, and I kept imagining I could see those lights through the curtains. Around midnight, I heard Sarah creep into my room. Without a word, she climbed into my bed, just like she used to do when we were younger and there were thunderstorms. "You okay?" she whispered. "Yeah," I lied. "You?" "Yeah." Another lie. We both fell silent, listening to the house settle around us. Then Sarah spoke again, so quietly I almost missed it. "Did you notice how the snow stopped falling around them?" I hadn't noticed that at the time, but as soon as she said it, the memory crystallized. She was right. While snow had been falling lightly all afternoon, there had been a perfect circle of clear sky around each fireball, as if they were burning holes in the clouds themselves. That was the beginning of the changes. Small things at first, the kind of things that are easy to dismiss if you're determined to believe everything is normal. The maple tree we'd been running toward that day died by spring, even though it had been perfectly healthy. Birds stopped visiting our backyard feeders. The neighbor's dog wouldn't go into their backyard anymore, just stood at the door and whined. Then the dreams started. They weren't exactly nightmares, at least not in the traditional sense. I would dream I was back in that snowy field, but I was alone. The 3 fireballs would be there, but instead of staying fixed in their triangle formation, they would slowly rotate, like a cosmic mobile hanging over a giant's crib. In the dreams, I could hear something like music, but wrong somehow, like a favorite song played at the wrong speed. Sarah had the dreams too. We never talked about them directly, but sometimes at breakfast, she would hum a particular sequence of notes, and I would feel my spine turn to ice, because it was the same, not quite music from my dreams. About a month after we saw the lights, I woke up to find my bedroom window wide open, snow dusting the sill and floor. I knew I had closed it before bed. Mom was strict about that during winter, but there it was, open to the night air. And on the snow-covered windowsill were 3 perfectly round marks, arranged in a triangle where the snow had melted away. Sarah's window had been opened too, with the same marks. We cleaned up the snow before our parents could see it, working in silence, both pretending our hands weren't shaking. The incidents escalated slowly over the next year. We'd find triangular patterns burned into the grass when the snow melted. Sometimes, late at night, our electronics would all turn on simultaneously, TV, radio, even Sarah's Game Boy, broadcasting nothing but static in a high-pitched tone that made our teeth hurt. Mom and Dad noticed something was wrong with us. How could they not? 2 previously rambunctious kids who now refused to play outside after sunset, who jumped at unexpected noises, who slept with their lights on. They sent us to a child psychologist in the city, but we stuck to our unspoken agreement never to mention the lights. What could we say that wouldn't sound crazy? The final straw came the following winter, almost exactly a year after we first saw the lights. Sarah shook me awake in the middle of the night, her face ghost white in the darkness. "Look," she whispered, pointing out my window. There, in the fresh snow of the back field, were 3 massive circles arranged in a triangle, each one perfectly formed as if pressed into the snow by something enormous and hot. And in the center of each circle was a single, small object that gleamed metallically in the moonlight. We watched, paralyzed, as pinpoints of light began to rise from each object, climbing higher and higher into the night sky until they formed the familiar triangle formation we'd seen that first time. But now we knew these weren't meteors or fireballs. They were something else entirely. Something that had marked us, chosen us for some purpose we still don't understand. The next day, we convinced our parents to move. We made up stories about bullies at school, about wanting to be closer to our cousins in California, about anything and everything except the truth. They gave in eventually, probably more concerned about our increasingly erratic behavior than our actual reasons. The night before we moved, Sarah and I snuck out to the backfield one last time. The circles were still there, but the metallic objects were gone. As we stood there, hand in hand, we heard that same wrong music from our dreams. But this time it was real, drifting down from the star-filled sky above us. We ran back inside and never set foot in that field again. It's been 30 years, but some nights I still wake up to find my bedroom window open, even though I live on the 15th floor of an apartment building now. Sarah lives on the opposite coast, but she'll call me sometimes in the middle of the night, and before either of us says hello, I'll hear her humming that familiar, impossible tune. And sometimes, on very clear nights, I think I can see 3 distant points of light arranged in a triangle, waiting, just waiting. Because deep down, I know they're not finished with us yet. Whatever they are, whatever they want, they're patient. They can afford to be. After all, they found us once in a snowy field in 1990. They can find us again. Redditor 4. I've never told anyone this story before, not really. Sure, I mentioned the strange object I saw that morning to my parents, but I left out the parts that came after. The parts that still wake me up some nights, heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat. But maybe it's time. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of what happened that crisp autumn morning when I was 12. It started like any other school day. Living out in the country meant catching the bus early, while the sun was still struggling to push back the darkness. That particular morning was unusually clear, the kind where the stars seemed to linger longer than they should, twinkling defiantly against the brightening sky. I remember checking my watch, 7:28 a.m., 2 minutes until the bus would rumble down our gravel road, kicking up dust and breaking the morning silence. The air was sharp with that distinct October chill, and my breath came out in little clouds that dissolved into nothing. I pulled my jacket tighter, shifting from foot to keep warm. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another satellite. I'd gotten pretty good at spotting them during summer camping trips with Dad, but something felt off. This object was different, jet black against the pale morning sky, and definitely bigger than any satellite I'd ever seen. No blinking lights, no solar panels, just a smooth, dark form hovering about 10,000 feet up. And it was spinning, slowly rotating like a coin losing momentum on a tabletop. I felt the first tendril of unease curl in my stomach. The object shouldn't have been visible at all in the brightening sky, but somehow its blackness seemed to cut through the light like a hole punched in reality itself. As I watched, the rotation began to slow, and that's when the silence hit me. You don't notice silence until it's wrong. Out in the country, morning has its own soundtrack. Birds, distant tractors, the whisper of wind through dry corn stalks. But in that moment, everything just stopped. The silence pressed against my ears like cotton wool, and I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud and too fast. The bus was late. My watch said 7:35, and still no familiar rumble of diesel engine. I wanted to run back to the house, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The object had stopped spinning entirely now, and I could have sworn it had dropped lower in the sky. The morning suddenly felt colder, much colder than October had any right to be. That's when my watch stopped working. The digital display flickered once, twice, then went dark. In the same instant, I felt all the hair on my arms and the back of my neck stand up, like the air before a thunderstorm. But there wasn't a cloud in the sky. Just that impossible black shape, now definitely closer than before. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was some kind of military aircraft, or a weather balloon, or anything other than what my racing mind was suggesting. But then it moved, and all my rationalizations crumbled away. The movement wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. It didn't fly or glide. It just was suddenly in a different place, like someone had cut and pasted it across the sky. 1 second it was high up, the next it had dropped to maybe 1,000 feet, directly overhead. The air grew so cold my teeth started chattering, and I tasted something metallic on my tongue. I finally managed to turn toward home, but my legs felt like they were moving through molasses. Each step was a struggle against some invisible force that seemed to be trying to hold me in place. The 100 yards to my front door might as well have been 100 miles. That's when I heard it, or rather felt it, a low vibration that started in my chest and spread outward, making my vision blur. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the absence of sound, a negative frequency that made my bones ache. I looked back over my shoulder, which was probably my biggest mistake. The object was right there, maybe 50 feet up now, and it was opening. Not like a door or a hatch, but like reality itself was peeling back, revealing something that my mind couldn't or wouldn't process. The blackness wasn't just the color of the craft anymore. It was like looking into a void that went on forever, a darkness that seemed to be looking back. I don't remember screaming, but my throat was raw afterward, so I must have. What I do remember is the light, not coming from the object but being pulled into it. The morning sunlight seemed to bend and twist, creating impossible shadows that moved in ways shadows shouldn't. And in those shadows, I saw shapes, moving things that didn't make sense, like trying to comprehend a fourth-dimensional object with three-dimensional eyes. The pressure in my head built until I thought my skull would crack. My nose started bleeding, warm drops falling onto my jacket and freezing instantly into red crystals. The metallic taste in my mouth grew stronger, and I realized my fillings were vibrating, sending sharp pains through my jaw. That's when the bus finally came. I heard it before I saw it, the familiar diesel rumble cutting through that awful vibration like a lifeline. The object reacted. The void-like opening snapped shut with a sound like a thunderclap in reverse, and suddenly it was gone. Not gradually, not with any kind of movement or trajectory, just gone, leaving behind only a perfect circle of frost on the ground where it had hovered. The bus driver, Mr. Henderson, didn't seem to notice anything wrong when I stumbled aboard. Neither did any of the other kids, though they gave me strange looks, probably because I was shaking so badly I could barely walk to my seat. The bus was warm, but I couldn't stop shivering for the entire ride to school. When I got home that afternoon, I ran to check the spot where I'd seen the frost circle. There was nothing there, not even dead grass. But my digital watch never worked again, and neither did any other electronic device I carried in my pockets that morning. My phone, my calculator, even the little electronic pet game I kept in my jacket. All dead, their circuits fried by whatever force had held me in place. For weeks afterward, I had the same recurring dream. I'm standing at the bus stop, but instead of the object opening above me, I'm the one who opens. My skin peels back like paper, revealing not blood and bone, but that same infinite darkness I'd seen in the craft. I always wake up just as I realize I'm not looking into the void is looking into me. I'm 32 now, and I've never seen anything like that object again, but sometimes, on clear mornings when the stars are still visible, I'll catch myself looking up, searching the sky for that impossible black shape. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can still taste metal on my tongue and feel that strange vibration in my bones. The strangest part? Every year, on the anniversary of that morning, my digital watches stop working, just for one day, just long enough to remind me that what I saw was real. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror on those days, I catch a glimpse of something in my reflection, a darkness behind my eyes that doesn't belong there, like a piece of that void followed me home and never quite left. I still take the long way around that old bus stop when I visit my parents. Some memories are better left undisturbed. Some places better left unvisited. But on quiet nights, when the silence grows too thick and the shadows too deep, I find myself wondering, did I really see what I think I saw that morning? Or did it see me? And more importantly, is it still watching? I guess some questions are better left unanswered. But every time I see a satellite track across the night sky, I can't help but wonder about that strange spinning object. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see the stars blink out, one by one, as something dark passes in front of them. Something that shouldn't be there at all. But maybe that's just my imagination. Maybe that's just what I tell myself to keep the real truth at bay. That somewhere up there, in the vast emptiness between the stars, something knows my face. Something remembers the 12-year-old boy who stood alone at a country bus stop and looked up at the wrong moment on the wrong morning and saw something he was never meant to see. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for me to look up again. Redditor 5. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Even now, 3 years later, I wake up in cold sweats when the northern lights dance across the sky. My therapist says writing it down might help, so here goes. It was mid-January, and my best friend Mike and I were taking advantage of the fresh powder that had fallen. My backyard backs up against a decent-sized hill. Nothing spectacular, but good enough for some amateur snowboarding. We'd built a few small jumps earlier that season, and the new snow had covered them perfectly. The sun had set hours ago, but we didn't care. The floodlights I'd installed last winter lit up the slope well enough, and the full moon provided additional illumination. The temperature had dropped to about 15 degrees, but we were warm from exertion, our breath coming out in thick clouds as we carved our way down the hill. "More run," Mike called out as we reached the bottom. He was always pushing for just one more, even though we both had work in the morning. I checked my phone, 10:17 p.m., late, but not too late. "Yeah, okay. Last one, though, for real this time," I replied, unstrapping my board. The walk back up was always the worst part, but at least the packed snow made it easier than trudging through fresh powder. We were about halfway up when it happened. At first, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me after staring at the white snow for too long. But then Mike stopped dead in his tracks. "Did you see that?" he asked, voice tight with confusion. I nodded slowly, still trying to process what I'd witnessed. The entire northern sky had just flashed. Not like lightning, this was different. It was a sickly shade of green, almost fluorescent, like someone had switched on some cosmic light show. The flash had lasted maybe 2 or 3 seconds, but it had been bright enough to wash out our floodlights completely. "Aurora Borealis," Mike suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that himself. We'd seen the northern lights before. They were rare this far south, but not unheard of. This was different, more intense, wrong somehow. We stood there in silence, boards tucked under our arms, waiting to see if it would happen again. The night had gone eerily quiet. Even the usual, distant sound of traffic from the highway had disappeared, leaving only the soft crunch of snow settling beneath our boots. Then we heard it, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It started just at the edge of hearing, like the drone of distant power lines, but quickly grew in intensity. I felt it more than heard it, a resonance that made my teeth ache and my stomach churn. The second flash came exactly 30 seconds after the first. I know because I'd been counting in my head, trying to maintain some sense of control over the situation. This time, the green was even brighter, and I swear I saw shapes moving within it. Not distinct forms, but suggestions of movement, like watching shadows dance through frosted glass. The hum grew louder, and my nose started bleeding without warning. "We need to get inside," Mike said, dropping his snowboard and grabbing my arm. I didn't argue. We stumbled down the hill, the packed snow now treacherous under our boots. The third flash caught us halfway to my house, and this time I couldn't help but look up. God, I wish I hadn't looked up. The green light had structure this time, like a vast net or web stretched across the sky, and there were gaps in it. Tears in the fabric of the night itself, showing something beyond, something that hurt to look at. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was like trying to comprehend a new color or count to infinity. I felt something in my brain start to slip, like a gear stripping its teeth. The hum had become a physical force now, pressing against us like a wall of sound. Blood trickled from Mike's ears, and I could taste copper on my tongue. We ran the rest of the way to my back door, fumbling with frozen fingers at the handle. Just as we tumbled inside, I heard something else beneath the hum, a sound like radio static, but forming patterns, almost like words, but in no language I'd ever heard. The closest I can come to describing it is the sound of 1,000 voices whispering simultaneously, but all slightly out of sync. We slammed the door shut and huddled in my kitchen, not daring to look out the windows. The humming continued to build, and the green light pulsed through the blinds, casting alien shadows across my countertops. My dogs, usually so vocal about any disturbance, were dead silent, pressed into the corner of the room with their tails between their legs. The fourth flash, when it came, was different. The light seemed to penetrate everything: walls, furniture, flesh. For a brief moment, I could see Mike's skeleton through his skin, his organs pulsing with that same sickly green luminescence. He later told me he saw the same thing when he looked at me. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hum died away, the light faded, and normal sounds began filtering back in. The hum of my refrigerator, the distant highway noise, the wind in the trees outside. We waited for almost an hour before we dared to look outside. Everything appeared normal. Our abandoned snowboards still lay where we'd dropped them on the hill. The snow was unmarked except for our own tracks. Even the bloody nose and ears had stopped, leaving no evidence except a few red stains on our clothes. But something had changed. We could feel it, even if we couldn't explain it. The world seemed thinner somehow, like a sheet of ice in late spring. When I finally worked up the courage to check my phone, it showed 10:47 p.m. Minimum amount of time had passed since I'd last checked the time, though it felt like hours. Mike crashed on my couch that night. Neither of us wanted to be alone. We tried to talk about what we'd seen, but the words felt inadequate. How do you describe something that shouldn't be possible? Something that felt like it came from outside our understanding of reality itself. The next day, we searched online for any mentions of strange lights or sounds in our area. We found nothing. No news reports, no social media posts, not even any mentions on local community forums. It was as if we were the only ones who had witnessed it. But here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. Every so often, usually on particularly cold, clear nights, I'll catch a glimpse of that same green tinge in the northern sky. Just for a second, just at the corner of my vision. And sometimes, when it's very quiet, I can feel that hum again, just at the edge of hearing. A reminder that whatever we saw that night is still out there. Mike moved away 6 months later, said he couldn't handle the memories. I don't blame him. I would have moved too if I could afford it. Instead, I've taken down the floodlights and let the small jumps on the hill collapse under the weather. I don't go snowboarding anymore. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with us, despite the occasional nosebleeds we both still get. The therapist suggests it might have been a shared hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion. But I know what we saw, I know what we heard. And sometimes, on nights like tonight, when the wind dies down and the world goes quiet, I swear I can hear those whispered voices again. They're clearer now, more distinct, and lately I've started to understand what they're saying. I wish I hadn't. Redditor 6. I still check the sky every night before I go to bed. My brother Jake says I'm being paranoid, but he wasn't the one who made eye contact with it. At least, I think that's what happened. I'm getting ahead of myself, though. Let me start from the beginning. Last summer was unusually hot in our small Ohio town. The kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the pavement and turns your car into an oven. Jake and I had fallen into a routine of late-night bike rides to escape the worst of it. Mom wasn't thrilled about us being out after dark, but at 15 and 17, we'd convinced her we were old enough to handle ourselves. The night everything changed started like any other. The digital thermometer on our front porch finally dipped below 80 degrees around 9:30 p.m. I grabbed my phone, shoved it in the pocket of my basketball shorts, and wheeled my bike out of the garage. Jake was already waiting at the end of our driveway, the red reflector on his bike catching the streetlight. "Race you to the Wilsons?" he called out, already pushing off. "Cheater!" I shouted, scrambling onto my seat and pedaling hard to catch up. The Wilsons lived about a mile away, and their son Matt was in my class at school. We'd been spending a lot of time at their house that summer, mainly because they had a pool and didn't mind us using it. The night air felt good on my skin as we rode, carrying the scent of fresh-cut grass and someone's late-night barbecue. We were about halfway there when I noticed the light. At first, it was just another pinprick in the sky, moving steadily like the dozens of planes we saw every night. Living near Columbus International meant the sight was so common we barely registered it anymore. But something about this light made me slow down, my legs gradually stopping their rhythm on the pedals. "Jake," I called out, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. "Look up there." He circled back, following my pointed finger. "Probably heading to the airport," he said. But he didn't sound convinced. The light was white, but not the harsh white of airplane headlights. It was softer somehow, with an almost pearlescent quality that made it hard to look at directly. We stood there straddling our bikes in the middle of Cedar Avenue, heads tilted back, watching. That's when it happened. The light stopped moving, not gradually, like a plane banking or turning, but instantly. 1 second it was drifting across the sky, the next it was completely still. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Are you seeing this?" Jake whispered. Before I could answer, the light began to pulse. Not like a blinking aircraft warning light. This was more like a heartbeat, growing slightly larger, then contracting. With each pulse, it seemed to get closer, though it never actually moved from its position in the sky. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking as I tried to open the camera app, but as soon as I raised it to take a picture, the light dimmed until it was barely visible. When I lowered the phone, it brightened again. "It knows," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "It knows we're watching it." Jake made a sound that might have been a laugh, but it came out more like a whimper. "Don't be stupid," he said, but his voice cracked on the last word. The pulsing stopped. The light hung there, perfectly still and bright for what felt like hours but must have been only seconds. Then it moved. I've spent months trying to figure out how to describe what we saw next. The light didn't zoom away like in the movies. It didn't make any sound or leave any trail. One moment it was there, and in the next fraction of a second it had crossed what must have been miles of sky, stopping again directly above us. My neck hurt from looking up, but I couldn't look away. The light was bigger now, close enough that I could see it wasn't just a simple sphere. There were patterns in it, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and change even as I tried to focus on them. And at its center, there was something darker. That's when I felt it. A pressure in my head, like someone pressing their thumbs against my temples. But it wasn't painful. It felt more like curiosity, as if something was gently probing, trying to understand. And then I saw them, within the dark center of the light, 2 points of deep, midnight blue. They weren't exactly eyes, but in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that something was looking back at me. Jake must have felt it too, because he suddenly grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "We need to go," he said, his voice high and tight with fear. "Now." The spell broke. I looked away from the light, my eyes struggling to adjust to the darkness at ground level. We both jumped on our bikes, pedaling harder than we ever had before. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it watching us, that gentle pressure still lingering in my mind. We made it home in record time, throwing our bikes down in the driveway and running inside. Mom was watching TV in the living room and asked why we were back so early. We mumbled something about feeling tired and rushed upstairs. That night, I lay in bed with my curtains tightly closed, but I could still see the afterimage of that light when I closed my eyes. The geometric patterns, the dark center, those 2 points of deepest blue. Sleep seemed impossible. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from Jake. "Do you feel that?" I did. The same gentle pressure from before, like someone or something was trying to reach out. I got up and went to his room, finding him sitting up in bed, staring out his window. "Look," he whispered. Through the glass, I could see a familiar soft white glow reflecting off the neighbor's roof. We didn't sleep at all that night, or much the next few nights either. The light would appear randomly, sometimes high in the sky, sometimes seeming to hover just above the tree line, always with that same sense of curious probing, like it was trying to understand us as much as we were trying to understand it. After a week, the visits stopped. Life gradually returned to normal, or something close to it. Jake and I never talked about what happened, not really. What was there to say? We knew what we saw, what we felt, but putting it into words seemed impossible. But things were different after that summer. I noticed Jake started taking astronomy classes in college. As for me, I developed an obsession with theoretical physics and the concept of consciousness. We're both looking for answers, I think, just in different ways. I still take late-night bike rides sometimes, though never as far as the Wilson's house. And every time I do, I feel that same mix of hope and fear. Hope that I'll see that light again, and fear of what might happen if I do. Because here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. I don't think we discovered them that summer evening. I think they discovered us. And sometimes when I'm lying in bed and that familiar pressure builds in my temples, I wonder if they're still watching, still trying to understand. Maybe that's why I check the sky every night before I go to bed. Not because I'm paranoid, like Jake says, but because I know they're out there. And I know they remember us too. After all, how could you forget someone once you've looked into their eyes? Redditor 7. I used to love watching the night sky. Used to spend hours tracking satellites, counting stars, mapping constellations. Now, I keep my blinds shut tight after sunset. Some things aren't meant to be witnessed, and some patterns aren't meant to be understood. It started 3 years ago during one of my regular stargazing sessions. Just me, my lawn chair, and the vast expanse above. The night was unusually clear, one of those rare evenings when the city's light pollution seemed to retreat, leaving the stars to pierce through the darkness like tiny daggers. I'd been tracking satellites for years. You get used to their movements, their predictable paths. They're like clockwork, really. That's what made it so easy to spot when something was different. It was around 2 a.m. when I caught the first one. A steady point of light moving west to east, typical satellite behavior. I was about to look away when I spotted another one approaching from the south. Nothing unusual there either. I'd seen plenty of satellites crossing paths before. The math and orbital mechanics behind it fascinated me. Different altitudes, different orbital planes. They might look close from Earth, but they're usually miles apart vertically. But something about these two made me keep watching. Maybe it was the way they moved, or maybe it was just instinct. The rational part of my brain kept saying they'd pass each other like all the others. But my gut knew something was wrong. As they converged, I sat up straighter in my chair. The air felt different suddenly, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. My breath fogged in front of me, though it wasn't particularly cold. The satellites were almost touching now, their lights growing brighter, more intense. Then it happened. Instead of passing by each other, they met. The lights merged for a split second, and then they changed direction, both of them simultaneously at impossible angles. No satellite can make turns like that. It's basic physics. They need gradual orbital adjustments, careful burns. What I saw was like watching a ball bounce off a wall, instant and sharp. I told myself I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. I even wrote it off as some strange atmospheric phenomenon I didn't understand. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. For weeks afterward, I scrutinized every scientific article I could find about satellite behavior, orbital mechanics, anything that might explain what I'd seen. Nothing came close. I started posting on astronomy forums, careful to phrase my questions hypothetically. Most responses were dismissive. Satellites don't do that, they said. You must have seen something else. I might have eventually convinced myself they were right, might have filed it away as one of life's unexplained mysteries. But then it happened again. This time, I wasn't alone. I'd convinced my friend Sarah to join me for a stargazing session. She'd been worried about me, said I'd been too obsessed with the sky lately. I thought having her there would help prove to myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. There, I pointed out a satellite to her. See how it moves? Straight line, steady pace. She nodded, following my finger. Then I saw it. Another light, approaching from a different direction. My heart started racing. Watch this one too, I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. They look like they're going to hit, she said, a note of concern in her voice. I couldn't respond. My throat had gone dry. Just like before, the satellites converged, but this time, something even stranger happened. At the point of collision, the two lights burst into 3 distinct points. They hung there for a moment, like a triangle of stars, before shooting off in completely different directions, none of which matched their original trajectories. Sarah grabbed my arm. Her fingers dug into my skin. That's not possible, she whispered. That's not. What was that? I couldn't answer her, because at that moment, I noticed something else, something that made my blood run cold. All the other satellites we could see, and there were several visible that night, had stopped moving. They hung motionless in the sky, like someone had pressed pause on the universe. Then, one by one, they started blinking. Not the usual steady reflection of sunlight, but deliberate patterns, like signals, like they were communicating. Sarah saw it too. We should go inside, she said. I didn't argue. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those nights I'd spent watching the sky, tracking what I thought were satellites. How many of them had been something else? How long had they been up there, pretending to follow predictable paths until they thought no one was watching? I started researching more intensively, but this time I wasn't looking at scientific papers. I dug into message boards, conspiracy forums, anywhere people might share similar experiences. That's where I found others. Not many, but enough. People from all over the world who'd seen the same thing. Satellites that moved wrong, that split apart, that seemed to communicate One post in particular caught my attention. The user claimed to be a former NASA employee. Their account was detailed, clinical even. They wrote about a classified program that had been tracking anomalous satellite behavior since the 1980s, about how certain objects in orbit didn't match any known launches, about signals that couldn't be decoded because they didn't follow any known mathematical patterns. The post was deleted within hours. When I tried to message the user, the account was gone. But they'd shared one detail that haunted me. The behavior of these objects had been increasing, not just in frequency but in complexity. They were getting bolder, less concerned with maintaining their cover. Last night, I broke my rule about not watching the sky after dark. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to know if it was still happening, if I'd imagined everything. I wish I hadn't looked. The satellites were there, dozens of them, more than I'd ever seen at once. They weren't even pretending to follow normal orbits anymore. They moved in geometric patterns, creating shapes that seemed to ripple and pulse against the backdrop of stars. And as I watched, frozen in terror, one of them stopped directly overhead. Its light grew brighter and brighter until it was painful to look at. But I couldn't look away. In that harsh white glare, I saw something else. Shadows moving within the light. Shapes that didn't make sense to my human brain. And I understood then what I was really seeing. Not satellites at all, but something using them as cover. Something that had been watching us, watch them. I slammed my blinds shut and haven't opened them since, but it doesn't matter. I know they're still up there, moving in their impossible ways, sending their indecipherable signals to each other. Sometimes, late at night, I see light bleeding through the edges of my blinds, moving in patterns that satellites shouldn't make. The worst part? I've started noticing people looking up more often. Not just astronomers or stargazers, but everyone, as if something is compelling them to watch the sky. And each night, there are more lights up there, more satellites performing their cosmic dance. I want to warn people, want to tell them to stop looking, to keep their eyes on the ground where they belong, but I know they wouldn't believe me, just like I wouldn't have believed it before that first night. So I write this now, not as a warning, it's too late for that, but as a record, because I've noticed something else recently. The real satellites, the ones we put up there, they're going dark. One by one, their signals are disappearing, and whatever's replacing them isn't even trying to hide anymore. Tonight I heard Sarah's voice on my answering machine. She was breathless, excited, said she'd seen something amazing in the sky, that I needed to come look right away. But there was something wrong with her voice, a metallic quality that hadn't been there before, a rhythm to her words that sounded more like those coded signals than human speech. I didn't call her back. Instead, I'm sitting here in my darkened house, listening to the humming in the air that gets louder each night, wondering how long until they stop pretending completely, until they no longer need the disguise of satellites and familiar patterns. I know now why they waited so long, why they used such a perfect cover. Because what better way to hide than in plain sight? What better way to observe humanity than by making us watch them, thinking we were watching our own creations? So if you're reading this and you still enjoy stargazing, my advice is simple: stop. Those aren't satellites you're tracking, and when you look up at them, you're not the one doing the observing. They are. Redditor 8. I've carried this memory with me for 23 years, locked away in the dusty corners of my mind where childhood certainties blur into half-remembered dreams. But lately, the green light haunts my sleep again, and I need to write it down, if only to convince myself it wasn't real. I was 11 when it happened, sleeping in what used to be our garage. Mom had converted it into my bedroom the summer before, her solution to my complaints about sharing a room with my younger sister. The space still carried hints of its former life. Concrete floors covered by cheap area rugs, exposed beams overhead, and 2 large windows where the garage door used to be. Those windows would become the frame for something I still can't explain. That night started like any other. I remember the soft whir of my box fan, the gentle ticking of the Mickey Mouse clock on my nightstand, and the familiar orange glow of the street lamp filtering through my thin curtains. I must have fallen asleep reading. I always did back then, because my paperback copy of Goosebumps was splayed across my chest when I woke up. And I did wake up. That's the part that still bothers me, even now. I wasn't groggy or disoriented like you are when you're half asleep. My eyes snapped open with the sharp clarity that comes with sudden alertness, like when you hear a noise in the middle of the night and every sense goes into overdrive. The first thing I noticed was the color. Everything in my room was bathed in an impossible shade of green, like someone had replaced all the air with liquid emerald. The light pulsed slowly, rhythmically, making the shadows dance across my walls in a way that seemed almost alive. My collection of stuffed animals on the shelf looked like silent witnesses, their glass eyes reflecting the otherworldly glow. That's when I heard it, a low, throaty hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. It wasn't loud exactly, but it filled every molecule of air in the room. The sound reminded me of the way my dad's electric razor would buzz against the bathroom counter, but deeper, more mechanical, and somehow alive. I sat up slowly, my heart drumming against my ribs. The book slid off my chest and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the humming silence. My blanket was tangled around my legs, but I barely noticed as I turned toward those massive windows. And there it was. Hovering just above Mrs. Peterson's maple tree was something that shouldn't exist outside of movies or comic books. It was huge, bigger than our house, and perfectly round, like someone had taken a giant silver dollar and set it spinning in the sky. But it wasn't silver. It glowed with that same impossible green light, pulsing from what looked like windows or portholes arranged in concentric circles around its circumference. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't even blink. The light seemed to reach into my head, wrapping tendrils of emerald around my thoughts until everything else fell away. Time became meaningless. I don't know if I sat there for minutes or hours, watching as the shadows of leaves danced across my walls like puppet shows from another dimension. The strangest part was that I wasn't afraid, not really. There was fear somewhere in the back of my mind probably, but it was overwhelmed by something else, a profound sense of wonder mixed with an odd feeling of recognition, like seeing a face you know you've seen before but can't quite place. I remember wanting to get up, to walk to the window and touch the glass, to prove to myself that this was real. But my body felt heavy, weighted down by more than just tangled blankets. The humming grew louder, or maybe it just seemed that way because everything else had gone so quiet. Even the crickets that usually chirped outside my window had fallen silent. The light began to pulse faster, the green deepening to an almost painful intensity. Shadows twisted and stretched across my walls like living things, and for just a moment, one heart-stopping moment, I saw something move behind the nearest porthole. A shape, darker than the darkness around it, pressed against whatever barrier separated us. I couldn't make out features, but I had the overwhelming sensation that it was looking right at me. And then, nothing. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through my windows, bright and normal and achingly ordinary. My alarm clock showed 7:15 a.m., its red digits a jarring contrast to the green that had filled my vision hours before. The book was still on the floor where it had fallen, and my blankets were still twisted around my legs. I scrambled to the window, pressing my face against the glass. Mrs. Peterson's maple tree stood exactly as it always had, its leaves rustling in the morning breeze. The grass below showed no signs of being hovering beneath something massive and impossible. No scorch marks, no flattened flowers in my mom's garden, not even a single broken branch on the tree. I spent that morning in a daze, waiting for someone to mention it. Surely someone else had seen it? The light had been so bright, the humming so pervasive, but at breakfast, Mom just reminded me to eat my cereal before it got soggy, and Dad was absorbed in his newspaper, complaining about gas prices. On the bus, kids chattered about homework and TV shows, and no one mentioned anything about strange lights or impossible objects in the sky. For years, I told myself it was just a dream, a vivid one, sure, but still just the product of an overactive imagination and too many sci-fi movies. I almost convinced myself too. Almost. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is hidden and the street lamps cast strange shadows, I'll wake up with that same sharp clarity. For just a moment, before my eyes adjust to the darkness, I'll see a hint of green light playing at the edges of my vision. And in those moments, I know, with the bone-deep certainty of that 11-year-old girl, that whatever I saw that night was real. The humming never really went away, you see. It's there in the quiet moments, in the spaces between heartbeats, waiting. And sometimes, when I look up at the night sky, I swear I can feel something looking back. Something that remembers me just as clearly as I remember it, waiting behind its portholes of impossible green light, biding its time until we meet again. I still sleep with a nightlight, by the way, but never a green one.